Morning all. I thought we could go back and look at Kramnik Aronian game 1. That is a very interesting match that is emerging. There was a brilliant game 3 decisive game with that queen sacrifice. And okay, some of you may have already seen analysis for game 1. Well, I hope I can bring something to the table, something in the perspective here if we go over it here on this channel. So let's have a look at it. Knight f3 was played by Vladimir. So this is like a chameleon opening. It can transpose into all sorts of things. If black plays c5, then we can play e4, Sicilian defence. Black could be not very committal either though with the pawns and play knight f6, and we might end up with either English or King's Indian fianchetto. All sorts of things are possible with knight f3. Okay, so Levon plays actually d5. And with d5 actually, you know, he might have the idea of c6, or there could have been other ideas, but it emerges now after d4, this commitment to d4, knight f6, we get a transposition into a rock solid Slav defense. Okay, so that dreaded triangle, knight c3, e6. Right, and black is of course voluntarily hemming in the bishop, and usually the bishop's sorted out with something like dc and b5 later to give the bishop usually b7. So that's the usual event, that this bishop is temporarily, it doesn't seem to be a particularly high quality piece, but that can be changed later. Now white's bishop on c1 sometimes doesn't fit very well in these types of positions. You may have seen many games, if there's a bishop on f4, sometimes it's prone to g5s later. So sometimes white is prepared actually to give up this dark squared bishop with a bishop takes f6, and in fact a bishop takes f6 is prompted now with this immediate h6. So no messing around with bishop e7 to unpin, just h6, asking the bishop, are you really going to take, or maybe you're going to retreat. Now retreating, there's a lot of analysis in the Slav, and Botvinnik did tons of analysis on many variations of the Slav, and there's some very sharp lines involving piece sacrifices even. I'm not completely sure if it's from this position, and let's not really go into that, but what occurred here is the bishop didn't retreat, just bishop takes f6, and when this happens it's quite fascinating. After queen takes f6, black doesn't want to play g takes here, unnecessary perhaps structural damage. Queen takes f6. What is happening here is now these knights can sometimes try and dominate the dark squares. And also, you know, white has a harmonious bishop because his pawns are on dark squares generally, and you know, with rook c1, white could aim, you know, later to try and maybe play cd or even c5 and try and dominate dark squares with harmonious pieces. Okay, e3, and now knight d7 was played, as if, you know, maybe e5 is of interest to black, a quick e5, but that's not really necessarily the case. Bishop d3, and now black plays d takes c4, releasing some of that central tension and that grip that black has. But now, you know, b5 later is going to be an important tempo gainer in some variations. What's very interesting here is that the bishop doesn't go to like e7 or d6, which is quite common. Instead it fianchettos here with g6. With this fianchetto, maybe e5 later will have a bit more power to it potentially, with this bishop striking across this diagonal. So one of the underlying concerns sometimes with black having the dark square bishop is the dark squares could be dismantled later, and this bishop could be a powerful piece. So in terms of temporary piece qualities and more permanent piece qualities, I think that's a very interesting perspective I'm trying to embrace recently. So from a sort of temporary piece quality perspective, it looks temporarily this isn't that great. This has got some dynamic potential later, this dark square bishop. White's knights have some potential later for getting grip on key central squares. And the flexibility, of course, with knights to choose which colour they want to drop onto. Wherever there's a weakness, they could hone onto a weakness. Okay, so after castles, bishop g7. And now White plays rook e1, which may seem a little bit strange if the idea is e4, but actually it also means, you know, maybe there's a retreat, bishop f1 possible. Okay, black now castles, and in fact e4 is played, and white might not necessarily want e5. If black allows e5, say the queen goes back, then maybe knight e4 would be useful, eyeing that d6 square. Now black plays e5, so not only stopping e5, but also the bishop now has scope potentially as well to come out. Black's keeping the e5 square kind of overprotected, a strong point, e5 here. Now with that bishop on g7, maybe, you know, white didn't want to liberate that bishop at all and keep it shut by its own pawn. So white plays d5 now. And interestingly now, rook d8 is setting up latent threat on the queen in some lines. Okay, so here it is interesting. You know, what is going on here? If actually d takes c, well, if d takes c, it looks as though maybe, you know, this attack could be used. Let's have a little quick check. It isn't a hugely tactical game. But let's say d takes c was played here. Okay, maybe black does actually just play b takes c. That looks briefly, on brief analysis, to be a strong move. Knight b6 is not needed because there could be knight d5 with some tiny advantage for white, maybe like this. Okay, let's go back. Instead, curious looking move, rook e3 was played. Rook e3. So what is going on here? Is white's intention to play something like rook d3 or move this knight and use the third rank in the future? Looks like a bit of a mysterious rook move here. Now black plays b5, attacking that bishop, and the bishop doesn't retreat. Instead, white plays d takes c6, attacking the knight. But it's not so clear cut as just taking the knight now. So black takes the bishop, but there's another option as well as taking the knight, which is played instead, which is to play knight d5. And now, of course, if queen takes c6, there's asked the knight e7 check. So actually, the queen, it goes here to e6. So, is this safe for black? You might wonder. You know, maybe what about, say, knight c7? No, if knight c7, then queen takes c6 is fine, and you pick up a lot of material. So, for example, so here after queen e6, now c takes d7, rook takes d7. So we have some pressure on d5 here, and the bishop has scope as well to add more pressure to d5. Queen a4 and now bishop b7, giving up this c4 pawn just to try and get this pawn in effect. So the trade of c4 for the e4 pawn. So we have a simplification now. A lot of pieces coming off. And when I was looking at this, and Chess Explained was doing a live stream on it, I just thought, hang on, isn't it going to be a draw soon? And I was very surprised here by the turn of events from this simplified position, because I really thought it looks a bit drawish. Now, with the influence of Daniel King recently, I guess I can now emphasise black has a 4-3 pawn majority, which could be important. White's 2-1 could be important. Now, this dark square bishop versus the knight, which piece is higher quality? here. As we know from last night's session with Chess Explained, he prefers bishops usually. The bishop sitting on g7 does have some targets, and you know, if black gets a dangerous pawn, say these pawns were wiped out, that pawn would be a kind of a useful focal point for the bishop to support a passed pawn. But that would be like a disaster scenario for white. So is this bishop high quality? Can white try and, say, isolate any of black's pawns and get, say, a whopping great knight on f5 or e4 without, you know, the f7 pawn? That would be an ideal position. So there's scenarios where the knight could really be better than the bishop, but there's some scenarios where the bishop's going to be great, and if not that pawn, sometimes also the bishop can come on and target other pawns like f2, other dark square pawns. So for the moment though, white has a natural looking move to exert more pressure on e5. So rook ae1 is played, and the pawn actually here is defended. And here is where it seems Kramnik goes crazy. Goes absolutely crazy. I mean, I was suggesting in Chess Explained's stream actually, h4. Now I had this idea actually. If h4, then you know, what does black do? You know, if h5, then maybe knight g5 is annoying, a nice knight hook, or you know, maybe h5 and to try and force g5, and then maybe g4, and then get a knight to e4, so black hasn't got f5 to dislodge a knight on e4. I was thinking like that. I thought that was kind of interesting, but I thought no, actually it's kind of weakening, isn't it, to play h4 here. But funny enough, another move which seemed just as weakening was played by Vladimir. So let's see actually what an engine thinks of this position. Is there any need for white to do anything with these pawns? In fact, you know, maybe okay, g3 here. In fact, g4 actually comes up. G4 actually comes up as a move, as one of the strongest moves. So that's very interesting actually. Is h4 really I guess it's assessed as pretty terrible. So f5, and now if h5 e4, this is a demo of that bishop really turning into a monster actually. So this isn't particularly hot as an idea. Say rook b3. Okay, let's say taking knight h4, rook e7. Trouble is this rook is protecting that. There's no problem, is there, for black here in this position? This bishop's just been improved. So maybe, you know, g4 is actually designed against, the main thing it's designed against would seem to be f5. So it is trying to somehow discourage maybe this bishop to play g4. But it seems the way events panned out in this game soon is, you can imagine if this pawn's exchanged off, technically white has just isolated these two pawns. So is white actually under great pressure here? If a move like g3 then is played, is it really a disaster? Just, you know, that will put the brakes on a little bit against f4. Maybe this is technically an alternative anyway than the game continuation. It doesn't seem there should be a major disaster in store for white from such a position. It looks about equal. So g4 does seem to carry with it a bigger kind of commitment that you know, if pawn was, for example, lost, there'll be more structural damage than we did. And in fact, as we know from a later game, there seems to be a g5 from Aronian. I'm not blaming these g-pawn moves, but they do seem a little bit surprising to me from both players that they're keen on these g-pawn moves. Quite, you know, surprisingly aggressive for very solid players with very solid reputations to be using their g-pawns like this. But it's sort of prophylaxis. I think one key point as well, which I think I mentioned on Chess Explained's live stream, that is if f5, there might be knight h4, and I didn't check with an engine, honest, but I thought knight h4 might be good here. But even this position, it seems technically it's good for black, even if this pawn is made isolated. Now why, you might think, why would this be better for black? Okay, the knight has to stumble and use tactics now to get back, which isn't brilliant. And there's this tactic being relied on. This is becoming very tactical to play the check, take, and take the bishop now. But that's not needed, that continuation. Black can play bishop f6. It seems about equal, really. But black is not obliged to go in with this f5 continuation. And what Aronian does is play, actually it seems one of the strongest moves, just king h7. So there's something subtle and powerful about king h7, which seems to prompt now g5 to be played. So why is it all of a sudden necessary to play g5? What is going on here? Let's give white a token move. Is it because f5 is now more powerful? With the king on h7. Let's imagine, for example, king g2 as an example. So say black does strike with f5. Now is this unplayable? I guess now this is unplayable. Knight h4. It's totally unplayable because the king supporting g6 would mean, for example, now that fg, there's no knight takes g6, and actually, actually maybe bishop f6 is actually on the cards because g5 knight f5. So say h3 bishop f6. So this is extending white's commitment, and black seems to be increasing an advantage here out of nowhere. So it just seems that g4 after king h7 is looking like white's going into a path of isolating his own pawns. But the battle maybe is about piece quality, to try and hem in or discourage this bishop, and black's central pawn mobility. Maybe it was quite simplistic a little bit earlier to have said about the 4-3 over here and the 2-1 over there, when in fact in the centre, where it's important to also grab central squares, the central action with f5 and e4 is of great concern for white. So that's the main motivation for white to just have calmly put on the brakes with g3. Maybe in hindsight, which is brilliant, that was better, because this isolation of the pawns doesn't look in principle that great. So we have check, now king g8, and black is again ready for maybe f5 and e4. But on the other hand, without the h pawn now, okay, white's isolated two of his own pawns, but imagine a scenario of f5. That knight maybe is sitting more comfortably now on g5, and then he challenged the knight, might even be met by h4 at some point, or f4. So I guess the concerns, the major concerns, the central pawn mobility, the quality of the bishop. So we end up in this scenario. But now this seems again maybe a little bit of a risky move, which might not have been needed to be played here, which was f4. But before we go into f4, it is a teensy-weensy bit better for black here. But I move out to engines are suggesting that rook a3, rook g3, rook b3. So if this was played, would it really be so bad for white? Can white just try and hold this position? Now rook g4, there's rook g3 in case you're wondering. So say f6, there's knight e4. Okay, let the pawns come there. It isn't so bad, is it? Even the knight can come somewhere like here. It doesn't immediately look completely, crushing. But in the game continuation after f4, it seems black advantage technically shoots up here. You see that f4, because it looks as though this bishop really now potentially has got targets all over the place on dark squares, a skewing possibility, White's using that pin, but that pin can be taken out of the picture here with rook b8, just counter-attacking b2. So we get a trade of e5 for b2, but the rook infiltration is a heavy price to pay. Surely, you know, the rook's active. White's 2-1 pawn majority is knocked out. Okay, e5 is a little bit under fire at the moment. It's protected at the moment, but what about, you know, a2? So if this rook wants to move, then this has to be protected for this rook to try and get into black's position. So knight f3 was played, offering a2. But in fact, there's another idea. Forget the rook coming into position, just e6 to break up black's king safety a little bit more. And here, again, it started looking a bit scary now for black, I thought, because white's rooks are sort of exposing the black king a little bit now. On the other hand, this bishop's quality is completely evident now across the diagonal, and there's a dangerous passed pawn potentially in the end game. But before the end game, you know, black has a lot of issues. So, okay, let's carry on. F takes e, rook takes e6, attacking g6. Now, clever little move. Aronian counterattacks on f3, the knight, and this is quite clever now, very clever indeed, because is like inviting this fork of f5 and g6, which white plays. But he's got in mind now a very, very powerful move to play rook f4, which I think engines really like this move, rook f4, and you might wonder why. Rook g5 is also another alternative, but rook f4, let's just say knight takes g6 would be terrible now. Bishop d4 check, and it's a disaster because now the two rooks on the 7th come in, and look at this. White's just completely lost here, faced with the, you know, rook h2 stuff. Eventually the checks will run out, and that's the end of white, because this bishop's also making a mating net. So this rook f4, white's really in trouble, it seems, after rook f4. And he accepts maybe his worst, and he's not doing a Mr. Bean. He doesn't want to make it even worse and a total and utter disaster. So I think he plays objectively best move, accepting he's a pawn down. He just, you know, retreats the rook, which we know from Paul Georgiou recently, you know, saying sometimes you just got to accept your worst and okay, minimize the damage, don't make it even worse. So okay, so here instead of a rook exchange, actually rook f6 was played, which is a bit surprising. Engine likes just exchanging off rooks here to simplify. And now, okay, rook g4, good move attacking that g6, because now that bishop's been hemmed in by its own rook. It isn't like before. King f7. Now rook c1. So the black king's getting a little bit exposure here, but black's still better. Bishop h6. You see, black's still better. And something really bad happens very shortly after check, king e8. It looks as though it's just a pawn advantage to black, and technically, of course, black's pawn up, which was one I sort of expect then. King d8. Now here, rook h7. Okay, that's still about a pawn up for black technically. Bishop moves to f8, and now here I think it's looking dangerous for white. As soon as black can coordinate the rook and bishop, it's going to be dangerous for the king. But apparently, okay, let's have a look. Check. And in this position, again, engine seems to think that black was just one unit up, only about a unit up here. So there was still something left, a lot of fight left in the game. So maybe it seems that move 40, this might have made Levon Aronian's task a little bit easier, rather than playing rook h8, apparently, with the idea of rook g8 and maybe going up on the pawn like that. The task, it seems, was made easier with this next move, rook d7. You see that evaluation shoot up, and that's why I wanted to show you this. The evaluation shot up to +4. So let's have a look. Maybe this is the critical moment of making it even worse than rook h8 instead. Let's say unpinning, rook g8 ganging up on g6. But even here, bishop d6, and it's starting to look quite grim because of this piece coordination. Check. If rook g6, then it seems bishop c5 check is really crushing. Let's have a quick look at this continuation. Check. Because of check, and then rook g1 winning material. So it is unpleasant. Even if this rook h8, rook g8 was played, it looks very unpleasant because black's pieces are springing into life, finding that h2 target and other targets, and white's king is weaker than black's king. Okay, so maybe it was starting to be lost, but it seems this didn't really help. Now this very powerful move, g5. So the knight, it hasn't got too many squares now after knight g6, bishop d6. The knight's kind of shielded off. If you look at all the knight squares, they're kind of all shut down apart from h8. But worse than that, the bishop's now coordinate again for these rooks to come in to white's position. And here actually Vladimir resigned. So let's look at an example, continuation. So say white tries to protect h2 like that, then he loses the knight, not good. Rook c1. Let's have a look. Check. Rook takes, losing the knight. That's not palatable. Where could the knight is actually, if rook, let's have a look in this position. If rook g7, then bishop takes h2 is a mate in 2. So this looks like there's no defense. We can increase the number of moves. There's no defense here. Giving up the exchange doesn't look particularly hot. The knight's attacked and rook d1's threatened, so even that doesn't really help at all. So bishop d6, it looks hopeless. Engine thinks it's hopeless as well. Vladimir resigned. Okay, so this was the first game of the match. If we look deeper at g4, there seems to be a very logical basis of it. So let's do an overview and summary of this game. So it transposes into Slav, I think semi-Slav technically, with the bishop hemmed in. And this fianchetto with the bishop was interesting. This rook e3 was very interesting. So one wonders, with a move like rook e3, it sort of gives the sort of indication this is either all being played before all preparation this game so far. b5, d takes c, so trading off the light square bishop eventually for that knight on d7. But it seems black got a nice position here with the potential for central pawn mobility. I know from experience that central pawn mobility like this can be really, really dangerous to handle. So there's a grave concern about it. And the way it was kind of managed created other issues. If white really has to play g5, g4 I mean, then he's splitting and weakening these pawns, and it's actually later the h2 pawn in particular was shown to be greatly vulnerable. So you can imagine in hindsight you might think g3, didn't that offer a better chance to keep solid, to keep the pawns intact, less pawn islands, less pawn isolation? Probably, I was a bit surprised myself with G4, but there does seem to be a severe issue on the cards here to address. So G4, instead of the incautious maybe F5, the much stronger King H7, making sure there's no technical possibilities like Knight H4 after F5, because G6 is now held. So G5 now evidently does split up White's pawns, but it's not so simple, because White is relying on E-file pressure and to damage Black's pawn structure and try and make some issues out of Black's king safety here with this piercing move E6. But it seems somehow Black was able to keep his king relatively safe, inviting a king walk. So King F7, king starts walking to the queen side, which is a little bit amusing, coming over there, leaving this knight kind of looking a bit silly actually as this king walks across the board, and actually leaving H2 as the target of choice now. So here it's lost. Vladimir resigned. Hope you got something from that. It was an interesting game. Very interesting. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.